Welcome to Her Journey, where we share the most powerful stories of women who refuse to be silenced. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Your support helps us bring more authentic voices to light. My name is Jay Brini, and at 74 years old, I thought I'd weathered every storm life could throw at me. I'd buried a husband, raised a son as a single mother, and built a life from the ashes of loss. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the moment my only child stood up at our family dinner table and delivered the blow that would change everything. The fork was still halfway to my mouth when Daniel said it, his voice cutting through the warm chatter of our Sunday dinner like a blade through silk. "I want to make a toast," he announced, raising his wine glass high. The candlelight caught the crystal, casting fractured rainbows across the white tablecloth I'd hand-stitched 20 years ago. "To Margaret," he continued, gesturing toward his mother-in-law with a kind of reverence I'd only ever seen him show to strangers. "This is the woman I wish had raised me. She's going to be the real grandmother to our baby, not just—" He paused, and for one hopeful moment, I thought he might catch himself, might realize the cruelty of his words. But then his eyes met mine across the table, cold and dismissive, and he finished his sentence with surgical precision. "Not just someone who happened to be there." The room went still. No clinking of glasses, no polite murmurs, just the sound of my heart shattering in my chest and the tick of the grandfather clock that had belonged to my mother. Margaret, his mother-in-law, smiled serenely, accepting the toast with the grace of someone who'd never had to scrape together grocery money or work 3 jobs to keep the lights on. My daughter-in-law Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her 6 months pregnant belly straining against her designer dress. She didn't look at me, couldn't meet my eyes, which told me everything I needed to know about how many conversations had led to this moment. Daniel's husband Cole chuckled softly, his eyes glued to his wine glass, as if fascination with the vintage could excuse his complicity in this public execution of my maternal legacy. And I felt my jaw go slack for a moment before it tightened, so hard I thought my teeth might crack. The woman who had raised him through chicken pox and heartbreak, who had taught him to drive in a rusted Ford because we couldn't afford driving lessons, who had sold her wedding ring to pay for his college textbooks, that woman had just been erased from existence. I set down my knife and napkin with deliberate precision, folding them neatly beside my plate. My hands didn't tremble, my voice didn't crack. 25 years of raising him alone had taught me to swallow my pain in silence, but this time was different. "Then she can finance your life from now on," I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of decades of sacrifice. I pushed my chair back and stood, the scrape of wood against hardwood ringing like a gavel in the sudden silence. No one moved to stop me. No one asked if I was okay. I walked out of my own house that night, leaving the door open behind me like an invitation for them to take what they wanted and go. I walked 6 blocks before I realized my hands were clenched so tightly they ached. I sat on a bench outside the elementary school where Daniel had once played on swings I'd pushed 1,000 times, and I felt something I'd never experienced before. Absolute clarity. When had I stopped being his mother and started being his burden? The walk home gave me time to think, and thinking was dangerous territory. Dangerous because it led me down paths I'd avoided for years, past memories I'd carefully filed away under necessary sacrifices and what mothers do. When I let myself back into the house an hour later, it was empty. They'd cleared out while I was gone, taking their judgment and their wine glasses with them. The dining room looked like a crime scene, half-eaten meals abandoned, my good china sitting in pools of congealing sauce, the candles burned down to stubs. I didn't clean it. Not yet. Instead, I walked down the hallway lined with photographs I hadn't really looked at in years. 25 years of Daniel's life stared back at me. Gap-toothed grins at school plays, graduation photos, his wedding day where I'd sat in the second row because Margaret had claimed the front for immediate family. I stopped at the photo from his high school graduation. In it, I'm wearing the same navy dress I'd worn to my husband Robert's funeral 6 years earlier, because I couldn't afford anything new. Daniel stands beside me in his cap and gown, but he's looking away from the camera, already focused on something beyond the frame. Even then, I was becoming invisible to him. But what hit me wasn't the photo itself, it was what I remembered about that day. After the ceremony, Margaret had swooped in with her professional photographer and her suggestions for better family arrangements. She'd organized a dozen different poses, always managing to position herself as the central figure, the one who belonged. "Let's get one with just the graduates and their real families," she'd said with a laugh that wasn't quite mean enough to call out but cut deep enough to draw blood.
¿Y patasida?
I always stepped aside. The phone rang, startling me from my reverie. For a moment, I thought it might be Daniel calling to apologize, to explain that he'd had too much wine, or that I'd misunderstood. But the caller ID showed my sister Linda's name, and I knew the news had already traveled. "Jay, honey, I just heard from Margaret's sister about what happened at dinner." Linda's voice was carefully neutral, the tone people use when they're trying not to take sides in someone else's family drama. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I lied, because what else do you say? That your only child just announced to a dinner table that you were a mistake? That 25 years of love and sacrifice had been reduced to someone who happened to be there? "Maybe he didn't mean it the way it sounded," Linda offered weakly. "He meant it exactly the way it sounded," I replied, surprising myself with how steady my voice remained. "The question is what I'm going to do about it." After I hung up, I found myself standing in Daniel's old bedroom, which I'd preserved like a shrine to a boy who no longer existed. His high school trophies still gleamed on the shelves, his college acceptance letters were still pinned to the bulletin board, and in the closet hung the suit I'd bought him for his first job interview. The one where I'd spent my entire grocery budget because I wanted him to look professional. That's when I saw it. A box I'd forgotten about, shoved behind his winter coats. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Mom, in Daniel's childhood handwriting. Letters he'd written me from summer camp, from his school trips, from college before he decided I was an embarrassment. I opened one at random. "Dear Mom, thank you for the care package. Tommy's mom didn't send anything, and he was really jealous of my cookies. I told him you make the best chocolate chip cookies in the world. I miss you. Can't wait to come home. Love, Danny." I read another.
Mom,
"I know college is expensive and I see how tired you are when you come home from your second job. I promise I'll make you proud. I'm going to be successful enough to take care of you someday, the way you've taken care of me. Your son, Daniel." Letter after letter, each one a testament to a love that had somehow curdled into resentment. When had "I'll take care of you" become "you're a burden"? When had gratitude become shame? I closed the box and made a decision. The boy who'd written those letters was gone, replaced by a man who saw me as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a mother to be honored. But if Daniel wanted to rewrite our history, he'd discover that two could play that game. Monday morning, I woke up with purpose for the first time in months. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, and began to document everything. Every birthday present I'd bought, every school event I'd attended alone while his father was deployed, every sacrifice I'd made to ensure he had opportunities I'd never dreamed of. The numbers were staggering. Over $200,000 in today's money, probably more if I included the opportunity costs, the promotions I'd turned down because they required travel, the dates I'd declined because Daniel needed help with homework, the dreams I'd deferred until someday, that never came. But this wasn't about money. This was about respect, about the casual cruelty of being erased from your own child's narrative. I called my attorney, Patricia Hawkins, a sharp woman in her 60s who'd handled my divorce from Robert's estate. Pat, I need to make some changes to my will. Of course, Jay. What kind of changes? I want to remove Daniel as my beneficiary. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Pat spoke, her voice carefully professional. That's a significant decision. Have you thought this through completely? More completely than he thought through his toast on Sunday. I see. Pat's tone shifted, becoming warmer, more personal. Would you like to establish alternative beneficiaries? Or are we talking about charitable donations? I've been thinking about this all morning. Both. I want to establish a scholarship fund for single mothers pursuing education. And I want to leave the house to Linda's daughter, Sarah. She's actually called me every week for the past 5 years. The paperwork would take time, Pat explained, but she could begin the process immediately. Jay, are you sure about this? Once it's done, my legacy will go to people who actually value it, I finished. After the call, I sat in my kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Control. For decades, I'd shaped my life around Daniel's needs, his schedule, his approval. Even as an adult, I'd continued to seek his validation, accepting his increasingly rare visits and shorter phone calls as if they were gifts rather than basic filial obligations. But Sunday's dinner had clarified something crucial. Respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And I was done earning it from someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth the effort. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Jay, can we talk? I think there's been a misunderstanding. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some misunderstandings were actually perfect clarity. Friday morning, Dr. Harrison's office felt like enemy territory, despite his warm manner and comfortable furnishings. At 74, I'd never imagined I'd need to prove my sanity to protect my independence, but Margaret's machinations had made it necessary. Mrs. Breeny, this evaluation is just a formality, Dr. Harrison assured me as he reviewed his notes. Your attorney explained the situation, and I want you to know that defensive legal planning is actually a sign of good judgment, not the opposite. The evaluation was comprehensive: cognitive tests, memory assessments, psychological questionnaires. I answered questions about my financial understanding, my awareness of current events, my ability to make reasoned decisions. After 2 hours, Dr. Harrison leaned back in his chair with a slight smile. Mrs. Breeny, you're operating at full capacity in every area we've tested. In fact, your scores are well above average for your age group. If anyone questions your competency, this evaluation will serve as excellent evidence to the contrary. What about grief? I asked. Could someone argue that my husband's death affected my judgment? Grief is a normal response to loss, not a mental illness. The fact that you're taking proactive steps to protect yourself actually demonstrates excellent judgment and future planning. He paused. May I ask what prompted this evaluation? I explained Margaret's campaign and her apparent plan to challenge my competency. Dr. Harrison's expression grew serious. Mrs. Breeny, what you're describing sounds like financial elder abuse by proxy. Someone is attempting to undermine your autonomy in order to control your assets or decisions. I'd recommend documenting everything. When I got home, I found Daniel waiting on my porch. He looked like he hadn't slept, his usual polished appearance replaced by rumpled clothes and red-rimmed eyes. Mom, we need to talk. Emma told me about the will. I unlocked the door without looking at him. What about it? You can't cut me out. I'm your son. And Margaret is your real mother, according to you. Real mothers should handle real inheritances. He followed me into the kitchen, his voice rising with desperation. That was a stupid thing to say. I was drunk. I was showing off for her family. You were honest, I interrupted. Perhaps for the first time in years. Mom, please. I know I hurt you, but this is extreme. Changing your will, selling grandmother's jewelry. How do you know about the jewelry? Daniel's face flushed. Margaret mentioned that some pieces had appeared at estate sales. So, you've been discussing my financial decisions with her. Interesting. I pour myself coffee with steady hands. What else have you two discussed about my mental state?
What?
Nothing. Why would we? Daniel, sit down. My voice carried an authority I hadn't used with him since he was a teenager. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. Margaret is planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so she can control my estate and my medical decisions. His face went white. That's not possible. She wouldn't. She's been asking around about my finances, my mental health, my ability to live independently. She's been planting seeds of doubt about my stability ever since Sunday's dinner. I leaned forward. And you've been helping her, whether you realize it or not. I haven't said anything bad about you to anyone. You told a dinner table full of people that I was inadequate as a mother. You've allowed her to position herself as the superior maternal figure. You've participated in conversations about my finances. I paused. You've given her everything she needs to build a case. Daniel sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I never meant for any of this to happen. Intent doesn't matter anymore, Daniel. Damage does. What can I do? How can I fix this? I studied his face, seeing the boy who'd once promised to take care of me and the man who'd publicly dismissed me in the same features. You can start by telling me the truth about something. Did Margaret ever explicitly say I was a bad mother? The silence stretched so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he nodded. When? Over the years. Little comments here and there. How I deserved better. How she would have handled things differently. How successful people usually come from more advantaged backgrounds. And what did you say when she made these comments? Another pause.
Nothing.
I didn't defend you. The admission hung between us like a physical weight. 25 years of unconditional love, and he hadn't been able to offer me even basic loyalty in return. That's what I thought, I said quietly. You can go now, Daniel. Mom, please.
Go.
And when Margaret asks about this conversation, remember that I know exactly what you'll tell her. After he left, I called Emma. I need a favor. Anything. I need you to start documenting Margaret's comments about me. Write down everything she says. When she says it, who else is present?
Can you do that?
Already started, Emma replied. After our conversation yesterday, I realized I needed to choose sides. I'm choosing yours. That evening, Linda called with disturbing news. Jay, Margaret has been asking questions at the country club about your eating habits, whether you're keeping up with housework, if you seem confused when people talk to you. What kind of questions? The kind that make people worried about elderly relatives. She's being very subtle about it, very concerned and caring. But she's definitely building a narrative. What narrative? That you're declining mentally and might be a danger to yourself. That someone needs to step in and make sure you're protected. I felt the trap closing around me, expertly constructed by someone who understood how to weaponize concern. But Margaret had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated the strength of a woman who'd spent 74 years fighting for everything she'd ever loved. Linda, I need you to do something for me. I need you to call everyone Margaret has approached and tell them the truth about what she's doing. Jay, are you sure? That's a pretty serious accusation. It's not an accusation. It's a defense. And if you won't help me, I'll do it myself. No, I'll help. I owe you that much. Linda's voice strengthened with resolve. I should have defended you years ago. I won't fail you again. Saturday morning, I began making calls. First to Mrs. Patterson, then to my former teaching colleagues, then to members of my church congregation. Each conversation followed the same pattern. I explained what had happened at Sunday's dinner, what Margaret was attempting to do, and asked them to consider the source of any concerns they might hear about my mental state. The responses were illuminating. Mrs. Patterson was furious. That woman came by here Thursday asking if I'd noticed you acting strangely. I told her you seemed fine to me, but she kept pushing, asking if I'd seen signs of confusion or forgetfulness. My former principal, Dr. Martinez, was equally disturbed. Jay, Margaret called the school yesterday asking about your employment history. She wanted to know if there had been any issues with your performance in your final years, any signs of cognitive decline. By noon, I documented 8 separate instances of Margaret conducting what could only be described as an investigation into my competency. She'd been thorough, professional, and utterly ruthless. But her thoroughness was also her weakness. In attempting to build a comprehensive case, she'd revealed her strategy to too many people, and those people were now warning me. Linda arrived at my house that afternoon with a notebook full of her own discoveries. Jay, you need to see this. I spent the morning at the country club, and the conversations I had were enlightening. She'd spoken to Margaret's closest friends, women who'd known her for decades. What Linda discovered was a pattern of behavior that went far beyond our current situation. Apparently, this isn't the first time Margaret has gone after someone she perceived as a threat, Linda explained. 3 years ago, she orchestrated a campaign against her own sister-in-law over a family inheritance. 5 years ago, she had her elderly neighbor investigated for hoarding after a property dispute. What happened in those cases? The sister-in-law ended up moving across the country to escape the harassment. The neighbor was forced into assisted living and lost her house. Linda's voice was grim. Margaret has a history of using concern trolling and institutional authority to destroy people who inconvenience her. Why didn't anyone warn me? Because she's very good at making her targets look like the problem. She positions herself as the caring, responsible person trying to help someone who won't accept help. That evening, Patricia called with an update. Jay, I've had my investigator look into Margaret's background. What we found is concerning.
Tell me.
She's been married 4 times. Each husband died or divorced her under suspicious financial circumstances. Her current wealth comes from her 3rd husband's life insurance policy. He died in a car accident 6 months after changing his will to benefit her exclusively. Are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything legally actionable. But I am noting a pattern of behavior that involves isolating vulnerable people from their support systems and then benefiting from their diminished circumstances. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Margaret hadn't just targeted me randomly. She'd identified me as an obstacle to her complete control over Daniel's inheritance and loyalty, and she was using proven tactics to eliminate that obstacle. But I had advantages she didn't know about. 25 years of teaching had given me a network of professional contacts who could vouch for my competency. 74 years of life had taught me the difference between genuine concern and manipulation. And most importantly, I had Emma on my side, someone with intimate access to Margaret's plans and conversations. Sunday morning, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. I called Daniel.
Mom?
I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Daniel, I need you to arrange a family meeting. Tonight. Everyone should be there. You, Emma, Margaret, Cole. 7 o'clock at my house. Mom, I don't think that's a good idea. Everyone's emotions are running high. Everyone's emotions are about to run a lot higher. 7 o'clock, Daniel. Don't disappoint me again. I spent the afternoon preparing for what would either be my vindication or my destruction. I arranged my documentation carefully. The competency evaluation, the financial records, the witness statements, and most damning of all, a complete timeline of Margaret's investigation into my mental state, compiled from the testimony of everyone she'd contacted. At exactly 7 o'clock, they arrived. Daniel looked nervous. Emma looked determined. Cole looked confused, and Margaret looked like a woman who'd come to a tea party and found a battlefield instead. "Thank you all for coming," I began, gesturing for them to sit in my living room. "I've asked you here because we need to address what's been happening since last Sunday's dinner." Margaret smiled smoothly. "Jay, dear, I think we're all hoping we can put that unfortunate evening behind us." "We're not putting anything behind us," I interrupted. "We're bringing everything into the light." I opened the first folder. "Margaret, would you like to explain why you've spent the past week conducting an investigation into my mental competency?" The room went dead silent. Margaret's mask slipped for just a moment before reassembling into an expression of confused concern. "I don't know what you mean." "Then let me refresh your memory." I began reading from my notes. Thursday, 10 a.m. Conversation with Mrs. Patterson about my concerning behavior. Thursday, 2 p.m. Call to Dr. Martinez about my employment history. Thursday, 4 p.m. Conversation with Linda Morrison about my daily habits. Margaret's face was growing paler with each entry, but she maintained her composure. "Jay, if I've been asking about you, it's only because I'm concerned." Friday, 9 a.m. Conversation with the pharmacy about my prescription medications. Friday, 11 a.m. Call to my bank about unusual account activity. Friday, 3 p.m. Discussion with the local adult protective services about procedures for wellness checks. Daniel was staring at Margaret in horror. "You called APS about my mother?" "I was concerned," Margaret said defensively. After Sunday's dinner, Jay seemed upset. Irrationally so. "I thought someone should check on her." "Irrationally upset," I repeated, "about being publicly dismissed as inadequate by my own son. Yes, that does seem completely unreasonable." Emma leaned forward, her voice steady. "Margaret, you also told me that Jay was probably developing dementia and that Daniel should consider having her declared incompetent." "I never said that," Margaret snapped, but her confidence was cracking. "Actually, you did. And I recorded the conversation." Emma pulled out her phone. "Would you like me to play it?" The silence in the room was deafening. Margaret looked around at the faces staring at her. Daniel's shock, Cole's dawning understanding, Emma's quiet determination, and my absolute calm. "You can't seriously believe," Margaret said, her voice rising, "that I would orchestrate some kind of conspiracy against an elderly woman." "An elderly woman whose inheritance you want to control?" I interrupted. "An elderly woman whose influence over her son threatens your position as the family matriarch. An elderly woman who represents everything you've taught Daniel to be ashamed of." "That's preposterous." "Is it?" I opened another folder. "Patricia, would you like to join us?" My attorney stepped out from the kitchen, where she'd been waiting with a digital recorder and a witness. "Margaret, I'm Patricia Hawkins, Jay's attorney. I've been documenting this conversation as evidence for the restraining order we'll be filing tomorrow." Margaret stood up abruptly. "This is entrapment. You can't record people without their consent. Actually, in this state, I can record conversations in my own home with one party's consent, mine," I said calmly. "Everything you've said tonight is admissible." "Daniel," Margaret turned to my son, desperation creeping into her voice. "You can't seriously believe I would harm your mother." But Daniel was looking at me, not her. "Mom, is this true? Has she really been trying to have you declared incompetent?" "Read the evidence yourself," I said, handing him the compiled documentation, "and then decide whose version of reality you want to believe." As Daniel read through the files, his face went through a series of transformations: shock, disgust, and finally, a kind of grief that I recognized as the death of illusions. "You used me," he said to Margaret, his voice flat. "You used my stupid, hurtful words to justify this campaign against my mother." "Daniel, you have to understand, I was only trying to protect." "Get out." Daniel's voice was quiet but implacable. Get out of my mother's house and don't come back. You can't be serious. After everything I've done for your family. Everything you've done to my family, Emma corrected, standing up. This ends now. After they left, Daniel remained in his chair, staring at the evidence of Margaret's betrayal. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I am so sorry. I enabled this. I made it possible. Yes, you did. I agreed. The question is what you're going to do about it. The week following our confrontation brought a series of conversations that felt like surgery, painful but necessary to remove the poison that had infected our family. Daniel came by every evening, not to apologize, though he did that too, but to understand how he'd been manipulated and how he'd participated in that manipulation. I keep thinking about all the times she made comments about you, he said on Tuesday night, sitting in the same kitchen where I'd once helped him with homework. How she'd framed them as concern, but they always left me feeling like you weren't enough. Tell me about the first time you remember feeling ashamed of me. Daniel was quiet for a long time. My senior year of high school. The honors banquet. You came straight from your shift at the hospital, and you were still wearing your scrubs. Margaret made a comment about how some families clean up for special occasions. And how did that make you feel? Embarrassed. Not of what you've been doing, but of how you looked compared to the other parents. He paused. That's when I started seeing you through her eyes instead of my own. And what did you see through your own eyes? A mother who'd just worked a 12-hour shift to pay for the very banquet we were attending. A woman who never missed one of my important moments, no matter how tired she was. His voice broke. I saw love, but I let her teach me to see burden instead. Wednesday brought a visit from Emma, who was carrying a box I recognized from Margaret's house. These are yours, she said, setting the box on my kitchen table. Margaret had them displayed in her china cabinet like trophies. Inside were photo albums from Daniel's childhood, albums I'd compiled and given to him when he moved out, albums that had somehow ended up in Margaret's possession. Pictures of birthday parties I'd thrown on a budget, Christmas mornings where I'd stayed up all night assembling toys, school events where I'd been the only parent cheering in the audience. She rewrote your history, Emma said quietly. She took the evidence of your love and hid it away while positioning herself as the real maternal influence. Why are you bringing these back to me? Because I'm pregnant, and I want my child to know what real love looks like. Emma placed her hand on her swelling belly. I want them to see pictures of a grandmother who worked 3 jobs to afford dance lessons, who sewed Halloween costumes by hand, who never missed a performance even when she was exhausted. And Margaret? Banned from our house.
Permanently.
Daniel finally understands that her kind of love comes with a price tag attached. It's only available as long as you're useful to her narrative. Thursday brought an unexpected call from Cole, Daniel's husband, who'd been largely silent during the confrontation. Jay, I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. I knew Margaret was asking questions about you, and I should have warned Daniel. I should have warned you. Why didn't you? Because I was a coward. Because it was easier to let someone else be the target of her manipulation than to risk becoming one myself. His voice was heavy with shame. But watching what happened Sunday night, seeing how she used Daniel's pain against you, I can't be complicit anymore. What do you mean? I mean, I've been documenting Margaret's behavior for years. Her pattern of isolating people, turning family members against each other, and benefiting from the chaos she creates. He paused. I have recordings, emails, and financial documents. If you ever need evidence of her character, I have it. Tuesday brought an unexpected visitor. Margaret herself appeared at my door at precisely 10 a.m., dressed in her signature pearls and carrying a bouquet of flowers that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Jay, dear, she said with a kind of smile that never reached the eyes, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I felt terrible about how dinner ended on Sunday. I stepped aside to let her in, curious about what game she was playing. Margaret never did anything without calculation, and this visit was no exception. I brought these for you, she continued, offering the flowers. I thought we might have a little chat about family dynamics. I accepted the bouquet without comment and led her to the living room. The same room where I'd once hosted Daniel's birthday parties while she'd been conspicuously absent, claiming previous commitments that somehow never prevented her from scheduling elaborate celebrations the following weekend. I want you to know, Margaret began, settling into my sofa as if she owned it, that I had no idea Daniel was planning to say what he said. It was rather awkward. Awkward, I repeated flatly. That's an interesting word choice. Well, you know how young men can be. Sometimes they speak without thinking. She laughed, a tinkling sound like expensive crystal. I'm sure he didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I studied her face, noting the careful makeup and the practiced expressions of concern. This woman had spent years positioning herself as the superior mother figure, always with plausible deniability, always with just enough kindness to make calling her out seem petty. Margaret, I said quietly, how long have you been encouraging Daniel to see me as inadequate? Her mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. The comments about my cooking being too simple for dinner parties. The suggestions that Daniel needed more sophisticated influences. The way you've consistently positioned yourself as the family's cultural authority while treating me like the help. Margaret's smile grew more strained. Jay, I think you're reading too much into normal family interactions. I've always respected your role in Daniel's life. No, I said, standing up. You've tolerated it while systematically undermining it. And now you've succeeded. She stood as well, her composure finally cracking. I came here to extend an olive branch, to suggest we work together for the good of the family. But if you're going to be paranoid and accusatory, then what? You'll tell Daniel I'm being unreasonable? You'll suggest I'm becoming one of those bitter old women who can't accept their diminished place in their children's lives. I walked to the front door and opened it. Save your energy, Margaret. The damage is already done. After she left, I called Linda. I need you to be honest with me about something. Shoot. Have you been hearing things? About me, about how I raised Daniel? Linda was quiet for a moment. What kind of things? The kind of things that would make my son believe I was a substandard mother who just happened to be there. Oh, Jay. Linda's voice was heavy with something that sounded like guilt. There have been comments. At family gatherings, mostly. Nothing direct, but Margaret has a way of making observations that stick. What kind of observations? Things like how Daniel turned out so well despite his challenging early circumstances. How wonderful it is that he's found a family that can give him the cultural experiences he missed. How some people are naturally gifted at nurturing and others. She trailed off. And others just do their best with limited resources. I finished. Jay, I should have said something. I should have defended you. Why didn't you? The silence stretched between us. Finally, Linda whispered, because it was easier not to. Because Margaret's criticism felt like it was about you, not me. Because I was a coward. That evening, I made another call, this time to my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old widow who'd watched Daniel grow up from her front porch. Mrs. Patterson, it's Jay Breeny. I hope I'm not calling too late. Not at all, dear. Is everything all right? I was wondering if you remembered Daniel as a child. What he was like, how we were together. Oh my, yes. That boy adored you. Used to brag to all the neighborhood kids about how his mom was the strongest person in the world. Said you could fix anything, solve any problem.
She paused.
Why do you ask? Just curious about perspective, I suppose. Jay, that boy loved you something fierce. I hope he still does. So do I, Mrs. Patterson.
So do I.
Wednesday morning, I drove to the bank for the first time in months to request detailed statements going back 25 years. The young teller, barely older than Daniel had been when he'd started college, looked overwhelmed by my request. "That's a lot of history, ma'am. Are you sure you need all of it?" "Every penny," I confirmed. "I'm conducting an audit. The printouts were extensive, and reviewing them was like reading the financial biography of my own sacrifice. Deposits for my teacher's salary, always modest. Withdrawals for Daniel's needs, school supplies, sports equipment, class trips, college application fees, graduation gifts, wedding contributions. I made a spreadsheet, categorizing every expense. The numbers were even more staggering than I'd estimated. In 25 years, I'd spent approximately $267,000 on Daniel's needs, not including the baseline costs of food, shelter, and clothing. For a single mother making a teacher's salary, it represented nearly 40% of my lifetime earnings. But the most telling entries weren't the large amounts, they were the small ones. The $20 withdrawals for pizza money when he was in college. The $50 for gas when his car broke down. The $100 emergency transfers when he'd miscalculated his budget. Hundreds of tiny rescues that added up to a pattern. I had always been his safety net, even when he no longer acknowledged my existence. I printed everything and placed it in a binder, along with copies of cards he'd sent me over the years, photos from events Margaret claimed I'd never attended, and documentation of every milestone I'd celebrated alone while she got the credit for raising such a wonderful young man. Then I called Daniel. "Mom." He sounded surprised, maybe even pleased. "I was going to call you about Sunday. I think we should talk." "I think we should too. Can you come over this evening?" "Of course. Emma's at her book club anyway." "Come alone, Daniel. This conversation is between you and me." He arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, carrying flowers and wearing the expression of someone who'd rehearsed an apology. I led him to the living room and gestured to the coffee table, where I'd placed the binder next to 2 cups of coffee and a plate of the chocolate chip cookies he'd once bragged about to his camp friends. "Mom, about Sunday?" "Sit down, Daniel." My voice was calm, controlled. "And look at this." I opened the binder to the first page, a photograph of him at age 6, gap-toothed and grinning, wearing a homemade Superman costume I'd sewn for Halloween because we couldn't afford a store-bought one. "Do you remember this?" I asked. He smiled, some of the tension leaving his face. "Of course. You stayed up all night finishing that cape." 3 nights, actually. I worked on it after my shifts at the diner. I turned the page. "Do you remember why you wanted to be Superman?" "Because he saved people?" "Because he saved people who couldn't save themselves. You told me you wanted to be like that when you grew up. Strong enough to help people who needed it." I looked at him directly. "People like me." I turned another page, revealing a bank statement from his senior year of high school. "This is the month I sold my engagement ring to pay for your SAT prep course. Do you remember taking that course?" His smile faded. "Mom, I don't understand what this is about." "This is about memory, Daniel. About the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell others." I flipped through more pages. Receipts, photos, cards, documentation of 2 decades of love expressed through action rather than words. "I'm not showing you this to make you feel guilty," I continued. "I'm showing you this because on Sunday, you told a room full of people that I was just someone who happened to be there. But this is the evidence of what happening to be there actually looked like." Daniel was staring at the pages, his face pale. I'm not finished." I turned to the final section of the binder, copies of his college letters, the ones where he'd promised to take care of me someday. "Do you remember writing these?" He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Then tell me when taking care of me became a burden. Tell me when my love became an embarrassment. Tell me when Margaret became the mother you wish you'd had, and I became the one you're ashamed to acknowledge. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. She makes everything seem easy, elegant. She never struggled the way you did, never had to work multiple jobs or worry about money. When I'm with her family, I feel like I belong in a different world. And what world is that, Daniel? One where things come naturally, where love doesn't feel like sacrifice. I closed the binder and leaned back in my chair. Love is sacrifice, son. That's the whole point. It's choosing someone else's needs over your own comfort, over and over again, until it becomes who you are. I paused. But you're right about one thing. Margaret's love doesn't feel like sacrifice because she's never had to make any. It's easy to be generous when you have everything you need. Daniel was crying now, silent tears that fell onto his hands.
I'm sorry, Mum.
I'm so sorry. I know you are, but sorry doesn't undo 25 years of taking my love for granted. Sorry doesn't erase Sunday night. What can I do? How can I fix this? I stood up, suddenly feeling every one of my 74 years. You can't, Daniel. Some things, once broken, don't get repaired, they get replaced. Thursday morning brought a call from Patricia with an update on my will revisions. Everything's drafted, Jay. Are you sure you want to proceed? More sure than I've been about anything in years. There's one thing we should discuss. If you're removing Daniel entirely, we need to include language that makes it clear this was intentional, not an oversight. It prevents legal challenges later. What kind of language? Something like, I am intentionally excluding my son, Daniel Breeny, from this will due to his decision to prioritize other family relationships over our own. This exclusion is made with full awareness and is not the result of oversight or diminished capacity. The words were harsh, but they were honest. Included. Jay, once this is filed, word will get out eventually. Legal documents have a way of becoming public knowledge, especially in smaller communities like ours. Good. Let it be public. Let everyone know that actions have consequences. After hanging up, I received an unexpected visit from Emma. She stood on my porch looking genuinely distressed, her pregnancy making her seem younger and more vulnerable than usual. Jay, may I come in? Please. I led her to the kitchen, where she accepted a cup of tea with shaking hands. I need you to know that I never encouraged what Daniel said on Sunday. I was horrified. But you weren't surprised, I observed. Emma's face crumpled. No, I wasn't surprised. And that's what makes me feel terrible. She took a shaky breath. My mother has been influential in how Daniel sees family dynamics. She has very strong opinions about what makes a good mother, and she's not shy about sharing them. What kind of opinions? She believes that struggling financially means you're not providing properly for your children. That working multiple jobs means you're absent. That making sacrifices means you're martyring yourself for attention. Emma's voice was barely audible. She's convinced Daniel that your love came with strings attached, that you made him feel guilty for your sacrifices. I felt something cold settle in my chest. And what do you believe, Emma? I believe that without your sacrifices, I never would have met the man I fell in love with. The Daniel I married is kind, hardworking, and generous, all qualities he learned from you. But my mother has made him ashamed of those origins. Why are you telling me this? Emma wiped her eyes. Because I'm pregnant and I'm terrified. Terrified that my child will grow up thinking love is something you purchase rather than something you earn through presence and sacrifice. Terrified that my mother will teach my baby the same toxic values she's taught my husband. I reached across the table and took her hand. What do you want from me, Emma? I want to know how to be the kind of mother you were. How to love my child enough to sacrifice without making them feel guilty for it. How to be strong enough to stand up to my own mother when she tries to undermine me the way she's undermined you. For the first time since Sunday's dinner, I felt a spark of hope. The first step is recognizing that love isn't about providing a perfect life. It's about providing consistent presence. Your mother never had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying you new shoes. I did, regularly. But Daniel never went barefoot, and the lights never got turned off. How did you make those choices without resenting them? Because they weren't sacrifices, they were investments. Every dollar I spent on Daniel, every opportunity one gave up for him, was an investment in the man I hoped he'd become. I paused. I just never imagined he'd be ashamed of the woman who made those investments. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Jay, I need to tell you something else. My mother is planning something. What kind of something? She's been asking questions about your finances, your mental health, your ability to live independently. She's been suggesting that you're becoming unstable. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. She's planning to have me declared incompetent. I think so. She keeps talking about how tragic it would be if you made rash decisions because of your grief over Daniel's necessary boundaries. I felt a cold fury building in my chest. Margaret wasn't content with stealing my son's affection. She wanted to steal my agency as well. Thank you for warning me, Emma. That took courage. I'm choosing which side of this family I want to be on, she said firmly. And I choose the side that understands the difference between love and manipulation. After Emma left, I called Patricia again. I need to accelerate the will changes, and I need to add something else. I want to establish a clear record of my mental competency. What's prompted this urgency? I explained Margaret's apparent plan. Patricia's professional composure slipped for a moment. That's quite an allegation, Jay. It's not an allegation. It's a warning. And I intend to be prepared for whatever she's planning. I'll arrange for a psychological evaluation by Dr. Harrison. He specializes in competency assessments for legal purposes. If someone challenges your mental state, we'll have documentation that you're operating with full capacity. That evening, I sat in my kitchen and made a list of everyone who might support Margaret's claims about my mental state. The list was shorter than I'd feared, but longer than I'd hoped. People who'd watched me struggle financially and mistaken poverty for incompetence. People who'd seen me grieve my husband's death and confuse sorrow with instability. But I also made a second list. People who knew the truth about my character, my competence, my love for my son. Mrs. Patterson, who'd watched me raise Daniel from her front porch. Linda, despite her earlier cowardice. My former colleagues from the school district. Emma, who was just beginning to understand the difference between wealth and worth. Margaret might have money and social connections, but I had something more powerful, the truth, and I was about to use it as a weapon. Why have you been collecting evidence? Because I was afraid she'd come for me eventually. Margaret doesn't tolerate anyone who might challenge her authority or threaten her position. His voice was grim. I've been building a defense for 3 years, just in case. Friday afternoon, I received a call from Dr. Harrison with unexpected news. Mrs. Breeny, I thought you should know that someone has been calling my office, claiming to be concerned about your welfare. Margaret. I can't confirm the identity, but the caller has been asking about procedures for involuntary commitment evaluations, claiming that you've been making irrational financial decisions and may be a danger to yourself. What did you tell them? That I couldn't discuss patient information with unauthorized parties, and that anyone with genuine concerns should contact Adult Protective Services through proper channels. He paused. Mrs. Breeny, this caller also asked about my fees for competency evaluations and whether I'd be available for emergency assessments. The implications were chilling. Even after being exposed, Margaret was still pursuing her plan to have me declared incompetent. Dr. Harrison, if someone does file a petition for involuntary evaluation, what happens? There would be a hearing. You'd have the right to an attorney, and any evaluation would have to be court-ordered. His voice was reassuring. But given your recent evaluation results, I can't imagine any court would find grounds for concern. That evening, Patricia called with an update on the restraining order we'd filed. It's been approved, Jay. Margaret is legally prohibited from contacting you directly or indirectly, from coming to your property, and from making inquiries about your health or finances. What if she violates it? Then she'll be arrested. The judge was particularly concerned about the pattern of harassment you documented. And my will. Finalized this afternoon. Daniel has been completely removed as a beneficiary, and the scholarship fund has been established. If something happens to you, your legacy will help single mothers pursue education, women who understand the value of sacrifice. Saturday morning brought the most unexpected visitor of all, Margaret's youngest daughter, Rebecca, whom I'd met only a handful of times over the years. Mrs. Breeny, I hope you don't mind me coming by. I heard about what happened with my mother. How did you hear? Daniel called me. He wanted to know if I'd seen this kind of behavior before. Rebecca's face was grim. I told him about what she did to our father. Your father? My stepfather, technically. Mom's third husband. The one whose insurance money funded her current lifestyle. Rebecca sat down heavily. She spent 2 years convincing him that his children from his first marriage were only interested in his money. She isolated him from his friends, his hobbies, everything that gave him identity outside of their relationship. What happened to him? He died in a car accident 6 months after changing his will to leave everything to Mom. Single-car collision on a road he'd driven safely for 20 years. Rebecca's voice was flat. The investigation concluded it was an accident, but his children always suspected otherwise. Are you saying she killed him? I'm saying she destroyed him psychologically first, made him believe he was losing his mind, that his children were plotting against him, that she was the only person who truly cared about him. Rebecca looked directly at me. By the time he died, he was a shell of the man he'd been. Whether the accident was intentional or just the final result of her psychological abuse, I'll never know. The revelation left me cold. Margaret hadn't just been targeting me. She'd been following a proven pattern of isolating and destroying people who stood between her and what she wanted. Why are you telling me this? Because Daniel's family deserves better. Because that baby Emma's carrying shouldn't grow up under my mother's influence. Rebecca stood up. And because someone needs to stop her before she destroys another family. That night, I called Emma with Rebecca's story. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Jay, we need to make sure she can never get near our family again. What do you mean? I mean, we need to build a wall of legal protection that even Margaret can't breach. Restraining orders, custody protections, medical directives, everything. Emma's voice was determined. And we need to warn other potential targets. People should know what she's capable of. Sunday evening, exactly 1 week after the dinner that had started everything, Daniel asked if he could cook for me. Not as an apology, but as a beginning. I want to try to earn back your trust, he said, standing in my kitchen with ingredients for the chicken parmesan I'd taught him to make when he was 12. I know it will take time. I know I might never fully succeed. But I want to try. As we cooked together, I watched him move around the kitchen with the confidence I'd taught him, using techniques I'd shown him, creating a meal that carried memories of better times. It wasn't forgiveness that would take much longer, but it was a start. Mom, he said as we sat down to eat, I have something for you. He handed me an envelope containing a check for $50,000. What's this? Partial restitution. For the financial support you've given me over the years that I never acknowledged. For the inheritance you've removed from your will.
He paused.
It's not enough, but it's what I can afford right now. I looked at the check, then at my son. Daniel, I don't want your money. Then what do you want? I want you to donate this to the scholarship fund I'm establishing. And I want you to understand that money can't repair trust. Only actions can. What actions? Consistency, loyalty, the kind of love that shows up even when it's inconvenient. I folded the check and handed it back to him. Start with those, and we'll see where it leads. Monday morning brought news that Margaret hadn't given up as easily as we'd hoped. Linda called with a disturbing update from the country club. Jay, she's been telling people that you've had a breakdown, that you're making false accusations against her, because you can't accept Daniel's natural growth away from an unhealthy dependency. She's violating the restraining order.
Technically, no.
She's not contacting you directly, and she's framing everything as concern for your mental health. She's very careful about staying just inside the legal boundaries. But Margaret had underestimated the network of relationships I'd built over 74 years. By Tuesday afternoon, I'd received calls from a dozen people who'd been approached by Margaret with her concerns about my welfare. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Margaret would express worry about my recent erratic behavior, suggest that family stress was affecting my judgment, and ask if the person had noticed any signs of decline. She was systematic, thorough, and utterly relentless. But she was also making a crucial mistake. In her desperation to discredit me, she was revealing her own character to people who'd known me for decades. Mrs. Patterson called Tuesday evening with an update that made me smile for the first time in weeks. Jay, that woman came by again today, asking if I'd seen you acting strangely. When I told her you seemed perfectly fine to me, she actually suggested I might be getting too old to judge such things properly. What did you say? I told her that at 82, I'd had plenty of practice recognizing crazy when I saw it, and that the only person acting strange in this neighborhood was her. Mrs. Patterson's voice was gleeful. Then I told her if she came back, I'd call the police. Wednesday brought an unexpected ally. Dr. Martinez, my former principal, called with a proposal. Jay, I've been thinking about what you told me regarding Margaret's investigation into your teaching career. I want you to know that I've documented our conversation, and I'm prepared to testify on your behalf if needed. Testify to what? To your competence, your character, and your dedication as an educator and parent. But more than that, I want to offer you something.
His voice was warm.
We have an opening for a substitute teacher in our district. Part-time, flexible schedule. Would you be interested? I'm 74 years old, Dr. Martinez. And you have 40 years of teaching experience and a mind as sharp as anyone I know. Age is just a number when you're dealing with the teacher shortage we're facing. The offer was tempting, not for the money, but for what it represented. Public validation of my competence from people who'd worked with me professionally. I'll think about it, I promised. Thursday brought the most significant development yet. Emma called with news that changed everything. Jay, Margaret made a mistake. A big one. What kind of mistake? She approached my doctor about my pregnancy, claiming to be concerned about the stress I was under due to your erratic behavior. She asked if stress from dealing with an unstable family member could harm the baby. I felt cold anger building in my chest. She involved your pregnancy? That's not the worst part. When Dr. Reynolds asked for specifics about your behavior, Margaret started making very detailed claims about things she couldn't possibly know. Conversations in our home, financial decisions you'd supposedly made, things that prove she'd been gathering information illegally. What did Dr. Reynolds do? She asked Margaret to leave and immediately called me to verify the information. When I told her the truth about what Margaret was doing, Dr. Reynolds said she was filing a report with the state medical board about patient harassment. What does that mean? It means Margaret now has an official complaint against her for attempting to interfere with medical care through deception. It's a serious charge, Jay. It could result in criminal prosecution. Friday afternoon, Patricia called with an update that validated Emma's assessment. Jay, The district attorney's office has opened an investigation into Margaret's behavior. The complaint from Emma's doctor was the final piece they needed to establish a pattern of harassment. What kind of investigation? Stalking, harassment, attempted fraud. If they can prove she's been systematically gathering information about you under false pretenses, she could face significant charges. How long will the investigation take? These things move slowly, but I'm optimistic. Margaret has left a very clear paper trail, and she's made enemies of some powerful people in the medical and legal communities. That evening, Daniel came by with news that Margaret had finally overplayed her hand in spectacular fashion. "Mom, she called my office today. She told my supervisor that she was concerned about my judgment because I was being manipulated by my mentally unstable mother." "She involved your career?" "She suggested that I needed family counseling to help me recognize that you were a toxic influence on my life." Daniel's voice was flat with anger. "My supervisor asked me if I wanted to file a harassment complaint with HR. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth. That Margaret was a family member who'd been systematically lying about you for years, and that I'd finally discovered the extent of her manipulation."
Daniel looked directly at me.
"I also told him that you were the strongest, most competent woman I knew, and that I was ashamed it had taken me so long to recognize that." Saturday morning brought the news I'd been waiting for. Patricia called with an update from the district attorney's office. "Jay, they're filing charges. Multiple counts of harassment, stalking, and attempted fraud. Margaret's been arrested. What happens now?" "She'll be processed and probably released on bail, but there will be conditions. No contact with you or your family, no inquiries about your personal information, no attempts to interfere with your medical or financial affairs. And if she violates those conditions, immediate imprisonment pending trial." The judge was very clear about the seriousness of elder abuse through psychological manipulation. That afternoon, Emma and Daniel came by together for the first time since the confrontation. They brought groceries, flowers, and something more valuable, a unified front against any future manipulation. "We wanted you to know," Emma said, "that we've made some decisions about the baby's future." "What kind of decisions?" "You're going to be the primary grandmother," Daniel said firmly. "Not Margaret, not anyone else. You're the one who understands what it means to love a child through sacrifice rather than convenience. And we want you to help us make sure our child never has to question whether they're loved unconditionally," Emma added. "We want them to grow up knowing that real strength looks like the woman who raised Daniel to be capable of recognizing his mistakes and working to fix them." Sunday evening, exactly 2 weeks after the dinner that had started this war, I sat in my kitchen reviewing everything that had happened. Margaret was facing criminal charges. Daniel was working to rebuild our relationship. Emma had chosen my values over her mother's manipulation. And I had discovered that I was far from powerless in the face of systematic abuse. The boy who'd once promised to take care of me was finally learning how to do it. Not through money or guilt, but through loyalty and respect, the only currencies that had ever mattered to me. 3 months later, Margaret's trial began, and with it came revelations that shocked even those of us who'd experienced her manipulation firsthand. The district attorney, a sharp woman named Sarah Chin, had built a case that revealed the full scope of Margaret's pattern of abuse. "Mrs. Patterson," D.A. Chin said during her opening statement, "has been systematically targeting vulnerable individuals in family disputes for over 15 years. The evidence will show that she uses concern trolling, financial investigation, and social isolation to destroy people who inconvenience her personal agenda." I sat in the courtroom gallery, flanked by Daniel and Emma, watching as witness after witness testified to Margaret's tactics. Rebecca, her own daughter, took the stand to describe what had happened to her stepfather. Dr. Reynolds testified about Margaret's attempt to interfere with Emma's medical care. Mrs. Patterson, despite her 82 years, delivered a devastating account of Margaret's escalating harassment. But the most powerful testimony came from Cole, Daniel's husband, who'd been building his case against Margaret for years. "I documented everything," he told the court, producing a thick binder of evidence. Phone calls where she discussed isolating people from their support systems. Emails where she researched legal procedures for declaring people incompetent. Financial records showing that she's benefited from 3 separate family disputes where the opposing party ended up institutionalized or deceased. The defense attorney, a nervous young man who clearly regretted taking the case, tried to paint Margaret as a concerned family member whose intentions had been misunderstood. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Margaret's own words, recorded during our final confrontation, provided the most damning testimony of all. This wasn't about protecting anyone, DH argued in her closing statement. This was about control. Mrs. Patterson saw Jay Breeny as an obstacle to her complete dominance over her son-in-law's loyalty and inheritance, and she systematically attempted to destroy Mrs. Breeny's reputation, autonomy, and mental health to remove that obstacle. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. Margaret was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 5 years of probation, and a permanent restraining order against our entire family. As the bailiff led her away, Margaret turned to look at me one final time. The mask of concern and maternal warmth was completely gone, replaced by naked hatred. But I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no anger, just the quiet relief of watching a threat being neutralized. Outside the courthouse, Daniel put his arm around my shoulders for the first time in years. "Mom, I'm sorry it took a criminal trial for me to fully understand what you were trying to tell me." "Understanding is what matters," I replied, "not the timeline." 6 months later, Emma gave birth to a healthy daughter they named Sarah, after my mother, whose strength had carried our family through its darkest times. I was in the delivery room, holding Emma's hand while Daniel cut the umbilical cord, officially beginning my role as the baby's primary grandmother. "She's beautiful," I whispered, cradling my granddaughter for the first time. "And she's going to know exactly how much she's loved." "Unconditionally," Emma agreed, tears streaming down her face. "The way you loved Daniel, even when he couldn't see it." The months that followed brought healing that felt like physical therapy, slow, sometimes painful, but ultimately restorative. Daniel and I began having weekly dinners, not to process our past, but to build new memories. Emma brought the baby by every few days, creating photo albums that would tell the truth about our family's love rather than Margaret's fabricated narrative. I accepted Dr. Martinez's offer to substitute teach, finding joy in sharing knowledge with a new generation while proving to myself and others that my mind remained sharp and valuable. The income wasn't significant, but the respect and purpose were invaluable. The scholarship fund I'd established with my inheritance began awarding its first grants to single mothers pursuing education. Each recipient reminded me of myself at their age, determined, struggling, and deserving of support rather than judgment. Daniel framed the first photo of him with baby Sarah and placed it on his mantle, directly beside a picture of us from his childhood. "Past and future," he explained when I noticed the arrangement. "The love that raised me and the love I want to pass on." One evening, as I was rocking Sarah to sleep while Daniel and Emma prepared dinner, I realized that Margaret had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible. In attempting to destroy my relationship with my son, she'd forced us to examine the foundation of our love and rebuild it on stronger ground. The woman who'd tried to erase me from my family's narrative had instead ensured that my story would be remembered, not as a victim, but as someone who'd fought for truth and won. "Grandma J," Daniel said from the kitchen doorway, using the name Sarah would eventually learn to call me. "Dinner's ready." I looked down at my granddaughter's sleeping face, seeing echoes of the boy I'd raised and the man he'd become. "We'll be right there," I whispered. We have all the time in the world. 2 years after Margaret's conviction, I found myself sitting in my garden on a warm spring morning, watching 3-year-old Sarah chase butterflies among the flowers I'd planted to mark our family's new beginning. Daniel was nearby, assembling a swing set he'd insisted on building himself rather than hiring someone. Return to the values I'd taught him about the satisfaction of work done with your own hands. Emma was due with their second child in the fall, and this time there had been no question about which grandmother would be the primary caregiver, which family traditions would be honored, which values would be passed down. I had become not just accepted, but cherished, not for what I could provide financially, but for what I'd always offered: unwavering love and the wisdom that comes from surviving life's hardest lessons. "Grandma J," Sarah called, running toward me with a dandelion she'd picked. "Look what I found." "That's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, accepting the weed as if it were a rare orchid. "Should we put it in water?" As we walked toward the house together, I marveled at how completely our family had healed. The wounds left by Margaret's manipulation had closed, leaving scars that served as reminders rather than sources of pain. Daniel had become the son I'd always hoped he'd be, not perfect, but present. He called every few days, not because he felt obligated, but because he genuinely wanted to share his life with me. He'd learned to see my love as strength rather than weakness, my sacrifices as gifts rather than guilt trips. Emma had blossomed into a mother who understood the difference between providing for a child and spoiling them, between showing love through presence and showing it through presence. She often asked for my advice about parenting decisions, valuing my experience rather than dismissing it as outdated. The scholarship fund had grown beyond my original endowment, attracting donations from other families who'd experienced similar manipulative dynamics and wanted to support genuine maternal sacrifice. Each year, we awarded grants to a dozen single mothers, helping them achieve educational goals that would transform their families' futures. My teaching position had evolved into a mentorship role, where I worked with young educators who were struggling to balance their careers with family responsibilities. Many of them reminded me of myself at their age: determined but exhausted, loving but overwhelmed, strong but underappreciated. "You know," I told one young teacher who was worried about taking time off for her child's school play, "presence is the only gift that can't be replaced or duplicated. Everything else is just stuff." Margaret remained in prison for the duration of her sentence, and the restraining order ensured that her release wouldn't affect our family. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she continued to maintain her innocence, claiming she'd been the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by an unstable elderly woman and her manipulated family. The narrative she'd tried to create about me, confused, vindictive, mentally declining, had been so thoroughly debunked that even her former allies had distanced themselves from her. The truth, as it often does, had eventually risen to the surface despite all attempts to bury it. On Sarah's third birthday, Daniel made a toast that echoed the one that had started our family's crisis, but carried entirely different meaning. "To Grandma J," he said, raising his glass of sparkling cider while Sarah giggled on my lap. "The woman who showed me what real love looks like. The woman who taught me that strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up and helping others do the same." He paused, looking directly at me with eyes that held nothing but gratitude and respect. "You're not just the grandmother we want for our children, you're the example we hope to live up to." As the small gathering of family and friends applauded, I felt a peace that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with love recognized and returned. The boy who'd once been ashamed of my struggles had grown into a man who understood that those struggles had been the crucible in which his character was forged. That evening, after the guests had gone home and Sarah had been tucked into bed, I sat alone in my living room with a cup of tea and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of profound contentment. The woman who'd walked out of her own house 2 years ago in shocked silence had been transformed through fire into someone stronger, clearer, and more purposeful than she'd ever imagined possible. The attempt to destroy me had instead revealed depths of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, but something prompted me to answer. Mrs. Breeny? This is Detective Williams with the State Police. I'm calling about Margaret Patterson. My heart skipped. Is she trying to contact my family again?
No, ma'am.
I'm calling to inform you that Mrs. Patterson died in prison last week. Natural causes, a heart attack. I felt nothing. No relief, no sadness, no sense of closure. Margaret had become irrelevant to my life long before her death, her power to hurt my family neutralized by truth and legal protection. Thank you for letting me know, Detective. There's one more thing, Mrs. Breeny. She left a letter specifically addressed to you. Prison officials have reviewed it, and it's not threatening. Would you like me to send it to you? I considered for a moment. Yes, please. Send it to my attorney's office. 3 days later, Patricia called to say the letter had arrived. Jay, do you want me to read it first? Or would you prefer to review it yourself? Read it to me over the phone. I don't want her words in my house. Patricia cleared her throat and began. Jay Breeny, I suppose you think you've won. You've turned my own family against me, destroyed my reputation, and convinced everyone that I was the villain in this story. But I want you to know that I don't regret anything I did. You represented everything I despised about weakness masquerading as virtue. Your poverty, your struggle, your martyrdom. You wore them like badges of honor when they were really just evidence of your failure to create a better life. Daniel deserved more than what you could give him. He deserved elegance, culture, opportunities that came from success rather than sacrifice. I try to give him those things, to show him what life could be like when you didn't have to count every penny or work yourself to death for basic necessities. But you poisoned him against me, turned him into someone who valued suffering over success, struggle over sophistication. You made him believe that your limitations were virtues and my advantages were character flaws. I may be dying in prison, but I'm not sorry for trying to save him from the small, constrained life you would have taught him to accept. I'm only sorry I failed. The scholarship fund you established is a joke, throwing money at other struggling women as if struggle itself is something to be celebrated rather than overcome. You could have taught Daniel to rise above your circumstances. Instead, you taught him to romanticize them. I hope someday he realizes what he lost when he chose your version of love over mine. Margaret Patterson, *. When Patricia finished reading, there was a long silence. Finally, she spoke. Jay, I'm sorry you had to hear that. Even in death, she couldn't let go of her delusions. But I wasn't upset. In fact, I was almost grateful for Margaret's final communication because it crystallized something I'd been trying to articulate for years. Patricia, she still doesn't understand the difference between struggling and choosing to struggle for something worthwhile. She never realized that I wasn't trapped by poverty. I was empowered by purpose. What do you mean? I mean that every sacrifice I made was a choice. I chose to work multiple jobs so Daniel could have opportunities. I chose to go without so he could have more. I chose to invest in his future rather than my comfort. I paused, feeling the truth of my words settle in my bones. Margaret saw those choices as evidence of failure. I see them as evidence of love. And Daniel finally understands that the life I gave him wasn't constrained. It was intentional. Every value I taught him, every lesson he learned from watching me persist through difficulty, shaped him into someone capable of genuine love rather than transactional affection. That night, I shared Margaret's letter with Daniel and Emma. Their reactions were swift and fierce. She learned nothing, Daniel said, his voice tight with anger. Even dying in prison, She couldn't admit that love isn't about what you can afford to give. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice. What bothers me most, Emma added, is how she tried to frame your strength as weakness right up until the end. She couldn't see that raising a child to value character over comfort takes more courage than she ever possessed. Let me ask you something, I said to Daniel. Do you think your life would have been better if you'd been raised by someone like Margaret? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. Mom, if I'd been raised by someone like Margaret, I would have learned that love is conditional on performance. That people have value based on what they can provide rather than who they are. That struggle is shameful rather than strengthening. He reached for Emma's hand. I never would have learned how to love Emma the way I do. Unconditionally, protectively, with genuine partnership rather than expectation of service. I never would have learned how to be grateful for what I have rather than always wanting more. And what about Sarah? I asked. What kind of grandfather would you be to her if you'd internalized Margaret's values? I'd be someone who judged her worth by her achievements rather than her character. Someone who loved her for what she accomplished rather than who she was. Daniel's voice grew firm. I'd be someone who taught her that love had to be earned rather than freely given. Emma nodded. Margaret's letter proves she never understood that the greatest gift you gave Daniel wasn't financial security, it was emotional security. The knowledge that he was loved completely, regardless of his circumstances. 3 months later, we held a small ceremony to officially dedicate the J. Brini Scholarship Fund's first permanent headquarters. A small office in the community center where single mothers could receive not just financial assistance, but mentorship and emotional support. This fund represents something more than money, I said to the gathered crowd of recipients, donors, and community members. It represents the belief that a mother's love, expressed through sacrifice and persistence, has the power to transform generations. I looked out at the faces in the audience. Young mothers who reminded me of myself 30 years ago, older women who'd walked similar paths, men who'd learned to value maternal strength rather than dismiss it. Some people believe that love should be easy, that it should never require sacrifice or struggle. But I believe that the deepest love is forged in the crucible of challenge, tested by adversity, and proven through persistence. Sarah, now old enough to sit quietly during important events, was perched on Daniel's shoulders, occasionally clapping when others applauded, even though she didn't understand the words. But someday she would understand. Someday she'd know the story of how her great-grandmother's love had been attacked, defended, and ultimately vindicated. The women this scholarship supports aren't asking for charity, I continued. They're asking for investment in their potential to change their families' futures through education and opportunity. They're asking for recognition that their struggles aren't evidence of failure, they're evidence of strength. After the ceremony, as we cleaned up the community center, Daniel approached me with something that looked like nervousness. Mom, I have something for you. Something I've been working on. He handed me a leather-bound book with the Brini family story embossed on the cover. Inside were pages of carefully written text, accompanied by photographs I'd never seen before. I've been interviewing people who knew us when I was growing up, Daniel explained. Mrs. Patterson, your former colleagues, neighbors, even some of my childhood friends. I wanted to document the real story of how you raised me. Not the version Margaret tried to create, but the truth. I opened to a random page and read. J. Brini worked 3 jobs during Daniel's sophomore year of high school, teaching during the day, cleaning offices at night, and tutoring on weekends. She never complained, never made Daniel feel guilty for the expenses his education required. When he was accepted to college, she sold her car and took the bus to work for 6 months to help pay his first semester's costs. Daniel didn't learn about this sacrifice until years later, when his mother's former coworker mentioned seeing Jay at the bus stop in winter weather, carrying stacks of papers to grade during her commute. I flipped to another section. The Halloween costume incident, as the neighborhood kids called it, became legendary on Maple Street. Daniel wanted to be a medieval knight, but store-bought costumes were beyond the family budget. Jay spent weeks researching authentic medieval armor, then crafted an elaborate costume from cardboard, aluminum foil, and fabric remnants. The result was so impressive that other parents asked if she'd take commissions. Daniel wore that costume to school events for 3 years, and it's still mentioned in his high school yearbook as most creative. Page after page documented the reality of our life together. The struggles, yes, but also the creativity, the love, the small triumphs that had shaped both of us. It was the antithesis of Margaret's narrative, a testament to the power of love expressed through action rather than affluence. Daniel, this is beautiful. But why did you feel the need to document all of this? Because I want Sarah to know the truth about her grandmother's strength. And because I want to make sure that no one, ever, can rewrite our family's history again. That night, I called Linda to share the news about Margaret's death and the letter she'd left behind.
I'm sorry, Jay.
Even from the grave, she couldn't resist one final attack. Actually, I'm grateful for the letter. It reminded me why I fought so hard to defend the truth about our family. What do you mean? Margaret's version of love was about appearance, convenience, and control. Mine was about presence, sacrifice, and persistence. Her letter proved that she never understood the difference, and that Daniel finally does. 6 months later, Emma gave birth to a son they named Robert, after Daniel's father and my late husband. As I held my grandson for the first time, I marveled at how completely our family had been restored and transformed. He's going to grow up knowing exactly who he is and where he comes from, Emma said, watching me rock the baby. No lies, no manipulated narratives, no shame about his family's history. And he's going to grow up understanding that love isn't about what you can buy, it's about what you're willing to give, Daniel added. The way you taught me, eventually. As I looked down at Robert's sleeping face, I thought about the legacy I was leaving behind. Not money, though the scholarship fund would continue long after I was gone. Not property, though the house would eventually be Sarah's. The real legacy was something far more valuable, the knowledge that love expressed through sacrifice creates strength that lasts for generations. Margaret had tried to rewrite our family story, to erase my contributions and claim credit for Daniel's character. But she'd failed to understand that truth has a weight and persistence that lies can never match. Love, real love, leaves evidence. It leaves evidence in the choices people make, the values they hold, the way they treat others when no one is watching. Margaret's kind of love left no evidence because it was transactional, temporary, self-serving. My kind of love had left evidence in every sacrifice I'd made, every lesson I'd taught, every moment I'd chosen Daniel's needs over my own comfort. And now that evidence was being passed down to a new generation, children who would grow up secure in the knowledge that they were loved unconditionally, protected fiercely, and supported completely. The woman who'd tried to destroy my family had instead strengthened it beyond anything I could have imagined. In forcing us to examine and defend our love, she'd helped us understand its true power. As I sat in my rocking chair that evening, holding my grandson while Sarah played quietly nearby, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with legacy. The story that had begun with a cruel toast had ended with a celebration of love that would echo through generations. Margaret Patterson had lost more than a legal battle. She'd lost the war for Daniel's soul. And in winning that war, I discovered that the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's becoming so strong that their attacks only reveal your power. The boy who'd once been ashamed of my sacrifices had grown into a man who celebrated them. The daughter-in-law who'd been manipulated against me had become my fiercest defender. The grandchildren who might have been poisoned against me would instead be raised to honor the strength that had made their family possible. At 76 years old, I had learned the most important lesson of all, that love expressed through sacrifice doesn't diminish with time. It compounds, growing stronger with each generation that receives and passes it on. And that, I realized as I watched Daniel read bedtime stories to Sarah while Emma nursed Robert, was the most perfect revenge of all. Thank you for joining me on this journey through her journey. If Jay's story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to hear that their sacrifices matter, their love has value, and their truth will always, eventually, be vindicated. Remember, the strongest families aren't built on wealth or convenience. They're built on love that's strong enough to survive any attack. Until next time, keep fighting for what matters most.